On September 4, 1944, the British 11th Armour Division entered the Belgian port city of Antwerp, expecting to find a scene of devastation. After months of retreat, German forces had consistently destroyed infrastructure to slow the Allied advance. Yet, to their surprise, Antwerp appeared largely intact. The docks were functional, warehouses stood ready to store supplies, and the rooftops of the city were unharmed. Unlike other ports which had been reduced to rubble during the German retreat, Antwerp remained fully operational. It was the second largest port in Europe at the time, and after Rotterdam's destruction in 1940, it had become the continent's most vital harbor in Western Europe. With a capacity to handle over 40,000 tons of supplies per day, it had the potential to drastically accelerate the supply of Allied armies advancing into Germany. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery immediately recognized the strategic value of Antwerp. Securing the port offered a lifeline for the Allied forces, whose supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. Months of rapid advances from Normandy had overextended logistics. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts were constantly delayed as they traveled hundreds of kilometers over damaged roads from the ports of Normandy. Tanks of the Third Army under General George Patton frequently ground to a halt, not due to enemy resistance, but due to a lack of fuel. Artillery units waited for ammunition that never arrived on time. The opening of Antwerp could alleviate this crisis, supplying frontline troops directly rather than relying on the overextended roads from Normandy. Montgomery immediately communicated with Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, emphasizing the port's readiness and the urgent need to secure it. Eisenhower, long concerned with maintaining a balance among Allied commanders, understood the value, but also had to weigh political and strategic considerations. Montgomery, ambitious and confident in his abilities, pushed for swift follow-through. Yet he did not immediately prioritize clearing the approaches to Antwerp. The port was situated roughly 60 kilometers inland from the North Sea, and the waterways leading to it through the Scheldt estuary remained under German control. Coastal islands and narrow channels were heavily fortified, and German forces had planted mines in the estuary, while artillery positions on the north bank could easily target any Allied ships attempting to pass. Despite capturing the city intact, the port remained unusable until the estuary could be cleared. Intelligence officers repeatedly warned Montgomery of the potential consequences of delaying these operations. Yet he had another objective in mind: Operation Market Garden. This ambitious airborne and ground offensive aimed to cross the Rhine and create a corridor into northern Germany, bypassing the heavily defended Siegfried Line. Montgomery believed that speed and audacity could end the war before Christmas 1944. Supplying Market Garden required vast resources: 3 airborne divisions, fuel convoys, and a secure front to support the advancing troops. He diverted attention and supplies from the Scheldt and the Antwerp approaches to focus on this high-profile operation. By mid-September, the Allies faced a mounting crisis in logistics. The capture of Antwerp had the potential to deliver tens of thousands of tons of supplies per day, yet the Scheldt estuary remained in German hands. Frontline armies were forced to ration fuel and ammunition, limiting operational momentum. Tanks and artillery units sat idle, while infantry struggled to maintain positions with insufficient support. The port's potential to sustain rapid advances into Germany was squandered. Montgomery's focus on Market Garden, while promising a spectacular strategic result, came at the cost of immediate operational needs. On September 17, 1944, Market Garden was launched. Airborne troops landed in Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem, aiming to secure key bridges over rivers and canals. However, German resistance was far stronger than anticipated. Roads became kill zones, and troops were cut off from reinforcements. Within 9 days, the operation had stalled disastrously. Thousands of Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The 1st British Airborne Division was nearly annihilated, holding only isolated positions at Arnhem.
Rinham, Montgomery declared the operation 90% successful, a statement that masked the human and strategic cost of the campaign. Meanwhile, the port of Antwerp remained unopened for supply purposes. The delay allowed the Germans to regroup, fortify positions along the Scheldt, and prepare for counteroffensives. The Allies had squandered a 3-month window in which Antwerp could have delivered massive quantities of supplies directly to the front lines. The first ships did not reach the port until late November, nearly 3 months after the city's capture. During this period, the Allies struggled with supply shortages, cold weather, and logistical bottlenecks, which slowed operations and increased casualties on the front. By the time Antwerp became fully operational, the strategic situation had already shifted. German forces had consolidated defenses along the Ardennes, preparing for what would become the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The delay in opening Antwerp directly contributed to the difficulties faced by the Allies during the winter offensive, as frontline troops lacked sufficient supplies to repel the German counterattack effectively. Historians have since debated Montgomery's decisions, noting that his ambition and ego, while driving bold operations, compromised basic logistical priorities. The failure to clear the Scheldt before Market Garden resulted in unnecessary delays and loss of life, demonstrating that even brilliant commanders can make critical errors when strategic vision overshadows operational realities. In essence, the capture of Antwerp highlighted a recurring tension in military planning, the balance between audacious offensive operations and the practical necessities of logistics. Montgomery's choice to prioritize Market Garden over securing the Scheldt allowed the Germans to exploit the delay, inflicting further hardships on Allied forces. While the port itself was a triumph, the broader strategic consequences of inaction and misprioritization reveal how logistics can determine the outcome of campaigns as much as battlefield heroics. Antwerp's capture was a story of missed opportunities, a city taken intact but rendered
initially useless by delays and mismanagement, illustrating that in war, timing and foresight are as critical as courage and daring. After the capture of Antwerp on September 4, 1944, the strategic significance of the port was clear to Allied commanders, but unlocking its potential required clearing the Scheldt estuary. This estuary, a twisting network of rivers, islands, and marshlands, controlled access from the North Sea to the docks. While the city itself was intact, the waterways leading to it were fortified, mined, and occupied by determined German defenders. German forces had anticipated the Allied advance and deliberately left the port city untouched while transforming the surrounding waterways into a deadly obstacle. Every kilometer of the estuary presented natural and man-made defenses designed to delay or destroy any ship attempting passage. The initial failure to prioritize the clearance of the Scheldt was a critical oversight. Montgomery's focus on Operation Market Garden diverted resources, manpower, and planning attention away from this pressing logistical challenge. Meanwhile, the Allied frontline armies were increasingly strained. Fuel shortages halted tank movements, artillery units were limited to essential rounds, and infantry units faced extreme difficulty maintaining their positions under these restrictive conditions. The Third Army, under General Patton, advanced with remarkable speed through France and Belgium, but this momentum stalled not because of German resistance, but because supply lines could not keep up. The port of Antwerp could have alleviated these pressures, yet the estuary's defenses remained in enemy hands. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Eisenhower demanded immediate action. The task of clearing the Scheldt fell primarily to the 1st Canadian Army, a force experienced in amphibious and coastal operations. The Canadians faced one of the most grueling campaigns of the war. The estuary terrain was inhospitable. Flooded polders, dikes, narrow causeways, and canals created natural kill zones. German defenders occupied elevated positions on islands and along the north banks, making every advance extremely costly. Mines,
anti-tank ditches, and concealed artillery further compounded the challenges. The Canadians had to attack in full view of defenders, often wading through cold, waist-deep water under constant machine gun and artillery fire. Each step forward was contested, and progress was measured not in miles but in meters. The operation began in earnest in mid-October 1944. Canadian units systematically assaulted German positions on Walcheren Island and the surrounding estuarine islands. Infantrymen fought through flooded fields and canal crossings. Engineers labored to remove obstacles and mines under enemy fire, and artillery units provided covering fire to suppress German positions. Casualties were severe. Soldiers drowned in flooded trenches, froze in the cold autumn waters, or were cut down by hidden snipers. Every position had to be cleared individually, a painstaking process that tested the soldiers' endurance, courage, and determination. The German defenders were no less resourceful. Though their forces were depleted after months of retreat, they had fortified the estuary for maximum defensive efficiency. They utilized artillery placed on elevated positions to dominate the narrow causeways, employed obstacles that forced attackers into predictable paths, and laid hidden mines that struck indiscriminately. German commanders recognized that delaying Allied use of Antwerp could alter the course of the campaign. They bought time with every defensive measure, understanding that even a single week of obstruction could have strategic consequences. The Allies, in contrast, had the port at their disposal but could not exploit it until the estuary was cleared. The human cost of the campaign was immense. Canadian forces operating in the harsh conditions of flooded fields and freezing waters suffered thousands of casualties. Tanks and vehicles bogged down in mud, requiring engineering crews to extract them while under fire. Infantrymen were forced to wade across waterlogged terrain, carrying heavy equipment while dodging bullets and artillery shells. The psychological toll was severe. Soldiers faced constant exposure to danger, cold, and exhaustion, with little opportunity for
rest or reprieve. Each inch of progress came at a significant cost in lives and morale. By early November, after 6 grueling weeks of combat, the shelled estuary was finally cleared. The islands were secured, German artillery neutralized, and minefields mapped or removed. Canadian forces had achieved the impossible, opening the critical shipping lanes to Antwerp. The first Allied supply ships arrived at the port on November 28, 1944, nearly 3 months after the city's capture. During this period, Allied armies had suffered from severe logistical constraints. Fuel shortages had stalled tanks, artillery units had been undersupplied, and frontline soldiers had endured cold and hunger as the autumn wore on. The delay cost not only operational efficiency, but also countless lives. The failure to prioritize the shelled clearance exposed a critical tension in Allied strategy, the conflict between ambitious operations and practical logistics. Montgomery's focus on Market Garden, while tactically audacious, came at the cost of sustaining existing forces. The delay in opening Antwerp forced Allied commanders to ration supplies, slow advances, and accept higher casualties in subsequent operations. The first weeks of winter saw the Third Army immobilized in Belgium, unable to exploit previous gains because essential resources had yet to arrive. The opening of the port, while a triumph of planning and courage by the Canadian forces, arrived too late to prevent the immediate consequences of neglect. Historians have debated Montgomery's decisions extensively. Some argue that Market Garden was a necessary gamble, intended to end the war rapidly and decisively. Others contend that the diversion of resources from Antwerp represented a strategic miscalculation with tragic consequences. By failing to secure the shelled estuary before launching Market Garden, Montgomery effectively allowed German forces to regroup, fortify, and prepare for the winter counteroffensive that would culminate in the Battle of the Bulge. The human cost of this decision, measured in thousands of deaths, injuries, and months of extended combat, cannot be overstated. The capture and delayed use of Antwerp serve as a case study in the importance of logistics and timing in military operations. While audacious maneuvers often capture the imagination and earn glory, the practical needs of supply, terrain, and timing often determine the ultimate success or failure of a campaign. Antwerp's delayed opening illustrates that even when a strategic asset is acquired, failure to prioritize and exploit it can negate its value entirely. The Canadian soldiers who fought through flooded polders and frozen canals paid the price for this oversight, their heroism ensuring the port's eventual usability, but after months of unnecessary suffering. By November 1944, Antwerp was finally functional, but the delay had allowed German forces to consolidate defensive positions and prepare for winter offensives. The Allies now had the port, but the previous months of stagnation had left them vulnerable to counterattacks. The Battle of the Bulge, launched in December, capitalized on the Allies' temporary logistical weakness. German commanders, aware of the delays in supply and reinforcement, mounted a surprise offensive that would test Allied forces to their limits. The delay in Antwerp had inadvertently contributed to the scale and surprise of this counteroffensive, highlighting how strategic misjudgments can have cascading consequences. The Scheldt campaign also underscored the critical role of Canadian forces in the liberation of Western Europe. Often overshadowed in popular histories by figures such as Montgomery or Patton, the Canadian Army demonstrated exceptional skill, resilience, and bravery. Their actions ensured that Antwerp would eventually supply the Allied armies, a critical component in sustaining the fight into Germany.
Yet the cost of this operation, the cold, the flooded terrain, the heavy casualties, served as a grim reminder of the stakes involved when strategic priorities and operational necessities are misaligned. In conclusion, the battle for the Scheldt estuary represents one of the most challenging logistical and operational campaigns of World War II. While Antwerp's capture was a strategic victory, the delay in opening the port imposed severe costs on Allied forces,
including stalled advances, unnecessary casualties, and vulnerability to counteroffensives. The campaign highlights the complex interplay between leadership decisions, logistics, terrain, and human endurance, illustrating that the outcome of war is determined as much by practical planning as by audacity on the battlefield. The heroism of the Canadian forces, who ultimately secured the estuary under harrowing conditions, ensured that Antwerp could fulfill its potential, but only after months of preventable suffering and strategic delay.
The months following the capture of Antwerp were marked by a severe mismatch between Allied ambitions and logistical realities. While Montgomery pursued the audacious Operation Market Garden, frontline armies faced the brutal consequences of supply shortages. Fuel, ammunition, and medical provisions arrived in insufficient quantities, often delayed by hundreds of kilometers of overstretched supply lines. The port at Normandy, particularly Cherbourg, was over 400 kilometers from the advancing front, and every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell, every spare part had to traverse this vast distance over roads torn by constant combat. The capture of Antwerp offered a solution, but until the Scheldt estuary was cleared, the port remained inaccessible. This gap between strategic opportunity and operational reality defined the autumn campaign of 1944. The Third Army, led by General Patton, exemplified the tension between speed and sustainability. Patton's forces had executed one of the most rapid and effective advances of the war, sweeping across France and Belgium, liberating towns and creating shock among German defenders. Yet this momentum was increasingly hollow. Tanks were immobilized by fuel shortages, artillery units had to conserve their limited shells, and infantry suffered the psychological and physical toll of prolonged operations with inadequate support. Every mile gained without secure supply risked overextension. In this context, the delay in opening Antwerp represented not just a missed opportunity, but a fundamental vulnerability. The port's 40,000-ton daily capacity could have transformed the logistical landscape for the Allies, enabling sustained offensives deep into the Low Countries and Germany itself. Meanwhile, the German High Command recognized and exploited these vulnerabilities. Following the failure of Allied forces to immediately secure and utilize Antwerp, German commanders methodically reorganized and reinforced positions in anticipation of winter operations. Even as their front lines contracted under relentless Allied pressure, Germany retained a significant capacity for localized counteroffensives. German intelligence closely monitored
the flow of Allied supplies and noted the limitations imposed by extended lines of communication. Every week of delay in opening Antwerp allowed German engineers to fortify defensive positions, repair damaged infrastructure, and stockpile the remaining fuel and ammunition essential for future operations. The interplay of Allied logistical shortfalls and German tactical preparation would soon have catastrophic consequences. Operation Market Garden, launched on September 17, 1944, was intended to bypass the heavily defended Siegfried Line and create a direct corridor into Germany via the Netherlands. Montgomery's plan relied on airborne divisions seizing critical bridges, followed by a rapid armored advance. Yet, the allocation of resources to this ambitious plan further exacerbated the logistical strains on frontline units. The operation consumed vast quantities of fuel, transportation assets, and artillery support, drawing attention and supplies away from the more pressing need to clear the Scheldt. Market Garden's initial gains were dramatic, but the operation ultimately failed to achieve its final objectives. Allied paratroopers faced unexpectedly strong German resistance, critical bridges were lost, and the corridor remained incomplete. This failure, in combination with the continued inaccessibility of Antwerp, left Allied forces vulnerable to both operational stagnation and strategic counterattacks. The Scheldt campaign, meanwhile, exacted an enormous human toll. Canadian forces undertook systematic assaults on German positions along the estuary's islands and causeways.
Engineers removed mines under constant fire. Infantry waded through flooded fields, and artillery units provided covering barrages against entrenched positions. Progress was measured in meters rather than kilometers, with every objective requiring meticulous planning and execution. The conditions were harsh: cold waters, relentless rain, mud-choked terrain, and constant exposure to enemy fire tested the soldiers' endurance and resolve. Thousands were wounded or killed in the campaign, and the psychological strain was immense. Despite these challenges, the Canadians succeeded in clearing the estuary by late November, finally enabling the first supply ships to reach Antwerp on November 28, 1944. The timing of Antwerp's opening, however, could not fully reverse the consequences of the preceding delays. By the time supplies began flowing, Allied forces had already spent months under severe constraints. Tanks that might have advanced into Germany earlier had been immobilized. Artillery units had operated with limited ammunition. Infantry units had endured cold and hunger while attempting to hold positions in Belgium and the Netherlands. The logistical bottleneck delayed planned offensives and allowed German forces to regroup, reinforcing defensive positions and preparing for a winter counteroffensive. The delay in Antwerp, therefore, was not a mere inconvenience. It directly influenced the operational tempo and strategic posture of the Allies in late 1944. German planners recognized this window of opportunity. They meticulously organized their forces for a major offensive in the Ardennes, intending to exploit the logistical weakness and extended front lines of the Allies. The timing was critical. With Allied supply lines stretched and Antwerp only recently operational, German units could achieve surprise and potentially destabilize the front. They amassed troops, armor, and artillery in secrecy, taking advantage of the Allies' preoccupation with Market Garden and ongoing supply difficulties. When the Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, commenced on December 16, 1944, it struck with devastating effectiveness. Approximately 200,000 German soldiers attacked a 75-mile front, catching American units off guard and causing catastrophic initial losses. The Allies' inability to sustain their positions earlier in the autumn had amplified the shock and effectiveness of this offensive. The consequences of Montgomery's prioritization choices became painfully evident. By focusing on Market Garden at the expense of clearing the Scheldt, Montgomery inadvertently allowed German forces the breathing space necessary to mount one of their final large-scale counteroffensives. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of American soldiers were killed
or captured during the initial stages of the Battle of the Bulge, and units faced extreme shortages of fuel, ammunition, and winter clothing. Had Antwerp been fully operational months earlier, Allied forces could have been better supplied, potentially mitigating the scale and impact of the German offensive. Instead, the delay allowed the enemy to capitalize on the Allies' temporary logistical weakness, highlighting the critical interplay between operational decisions and strategic consequences. Historians have debated Montgomery's decisions extensively. Supporters argue that Market Garden was an ambitious, bold attempt to end the war quickly, aimed at seizing key strategic positions deep in the Netherlands and Germany. Critics contend that the diversion of resources away from Antwerp was a catastrophic oversight, unnecessarily prolonging the war and contributing directly to the suffering and deaths of thousands of Allied soldiers. The campaign illustrates the tension between tactical ambition and operational necessity. Brilliant maneuvers on paper can be rendered ineffective if essential logistical groundwork is neglected. The Scheldt estuary, often overshadowed in popular narratives by more glamorous operations, represents a sobering example of this principle. The eventual opening of Antwerp, while a triumph of planning and courage by Canadian forces, came too late to prevent the immediate consequences of earlier neglect. Supplies began to flow, but the delay had already imposed severe operational constraints and contributed to the conditions that allowed the German Ardennes offensive to unfold. This sequence of events underscores the critical importance of timing, logistics, and prioritization in military campaigns. Even with brilliant strategic vision and battlefield prowess, the effectiveness of military operations is contingent upon the ability to sustain forces in the field, ensure consistent supply, and anticipate enemy responses. In summary, the autumn of 1944 demonstrates how the interplay of leadership decisions, logistical constraints, and enemy strategy can shape the course of a conflict. Montgomery's focus on Market Garden, while bold, diverted
attention and resources from the critical task of clearing the Scheldt estuary. This oversight delayed the operational use of Antwerp, placed immense strain on Allied forces, and indirectly facilitated Germany's final counteroffensive in the Ardennes. The heroism of Canadian forces, who labored under extreme conditions to secure the estuary, ensured the port's eventual usability, but at a staggering human cost.
These events highlight the often overlooked role of logistics in warfare and the profound consequences of strategic misjudgment, offering a cautionary tale for both historians and military planners alike. The opening of Antwerp in late November 1944 marked a turning point in the logistical capacity of the Allied forces, but the broader implications of the preceding delays continued to reverberate across the Western Front. By the time the first supplies began arriving in significant quantities, much of the operational momentum gained in the summer had been lost. Troops who had advanced hundreds of kilometers across France and Belgium during the rapid pursuit from Normandy were exhausted, under-resourced, and had faced months of operational attrition. The delay in utilizing Antwerp meant that armies which could have been resupplied in September and October were forced instead to endure severe shortages, limiting their ability to conduct aggressive operations and creating vulnerabilities that the German High Command was quick to exploit. The Battle of the Bulge, which began on December 16, 1944, serves as a stark illustration of the consequences of these strategic and logistical missteps. German forces, under the command of Hitler and his senior generals, launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, striking the thinly defended American lines with a force of nearly 200,000 troops across a 75-mile front. The initial shock of the attack overwhelmed poorly supplied units, causing substantial casualties and the temporary collapse of sections of the Allied front. American soldiers found themselves isolated, facing freezing winter conditions, limited ammunition, and insufficient medical supplies. The operational difficulties imposed by the
opening of Antwerp compounded the challenges, demonstrating that the neglect of logistics can be as deadly as enemy action. While the German offensive ultimately failed, it inflicted heavy losses and disrupted Allied plans for the final phases of the European campaign. The Third Army, under Patton, was redirected to relieve besieged units in Bastogne, requiring a rapid and costly redeployment that could have been mitigated by earlier resupply from Antwerp. Every division faced strain, not because of battlefield misjudgment alone, but because the essential lifeline of supplies had not been established when it could have made the most difference. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, and winter conditions magnified the suffering. The prolonged shortage of supplies and the delay in opening Antwerp exemplified a fundamental lesson of warfare. Operational success is inseparable from effective logistics. Historians have analyzed these events extensively, emphasizing the interplay between leadership decisions, operational priorities, and political considerations. Montgomery's choice to focus on Market Garden rather than clearing the Scheldt estuary first remains one of the most debated strategic decisions of the war. His supporters argue that Market Garden represented a bold attempt to end the conflict before the winter, seizing key bridges and opening a direct path to Germany. Critics, however, contend that this decision ignored the immediate operational necessity of securing a port that could supply tens of thousands of tons of materials daily. The delay created a window in which the Germans could regroup, reinforce positions, and prepare for the Ardennes offensive. In essence, the choice to prioritize audacious maneuver over logistical security had direct and severe consequences for the frontline troops. The clearing of the Scheldt estuary, accomplished primarily by Canadian forces, demonstrated extraordinary skill, determination, and sacrifice. The campaign involved the systematic reduction of fortified German positions across islands and waterways, often under intense fire and in extremely harsh conditions.
Infantry units waded through flooded fields. Engineers removed mines under constant threat, and artillery provided covering fire in an environment that was as physically punishing as it was dangerous. The operations progressed slowly, measured in meters rather than kilometers, highlighting the immense difficulty of securing supply lines in complex terrain. By late November, the estuary was finally under Allied control, and the first cargo ships reached Antwerp on November 28, 1944, 85 days after the city had been captured. These weeks of delay underscored how even a perfectly captured strategic asset could remain unusable without proper planning and immediate action. The opening of Antwerp eventually allowed Allied forces to replenish supplies and regain operational flexibility, but the timing limited its immediate impact. By the time supplies flowed in December, German forces had already taken advantage of the delay to mount one of their final major offensives in the West. The Ardennes offensive inflicted severe casualties, temporarily slowed the Allied advance, and forced the diversion of elite units to counter the German push. Although the Allies ultimately regained the initiative, The months of lost opportunity represented a measurable delay in the overall timeline of the campaign. Equipment, ammunition, and winter clothing that could have been delivered in September instead arrived under conditions of urgency and crisis in December. The consequences were not merely strategic, they were human, measured in suffering and death on the front lines. Beyond the immediate military implications, the events surrounding Antwerp, the Scheldt, and Market Garden reveal broader lessons about coalition warfare and the management of multinational forces. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, faced the challenge of balancing national egos, political expectations, and operational realities. Montgomery, the British Field Marshal, was a highly visible and celebrated figure, and political considerations influenced the allocation of resources and priorities. Eisenhower's need to maintain coalition harmony sometimes conflicted with operational logic, illustrating that strategic
decisions in war are rarely made in a vacuum. Diplomacy and political sensitivity can shape the conduct of military campaigns as profoundly as enemy action, and the human and material costs of misalignment can be severe. As winter set in across Western Europe, Allied forces had to contend not only with ongoing German resistance, but also with the environmental and logistical difficulties imposed by a harsh season. Supply lines, although improved with the opening of Antwerp, remained stretched. Artillery, armor, and mechanized units required steady access to fuel and ammunition, while infantry needed adequate food, winter clothing, and medical support. The successes of earlier campaigns were tempered by the realization that operational speed alone cannot substitute for logistical security. Antwerp's delayed utility served as a case study for future military planners. Strategic objectives must be matched with operational feasibility and immediate sustainment. In the larger context of the war, the events surrounding Antwerp and the Scheldt illustrate how operational missteps can prolong conflict and magnify human costs. The Allies eventually regained the initiative, advanced into Germany, and concluded the European campaign in May 1945. However, the autumn of 1944 revealed the fragility of even the most powerful military formations when logistical planning is insufficient. Every day that Antwerp remained unusable, every shipment delayed by hundreds of kilometers of inadequate transport routes allowed the enemy time to regroup, reinforcing the principle that wars are won as much by supply and preparation as by battlefield heroics. Ultimately, the lessons of Antwerp, the Scheldt, and Market Garden extend beyond the specific historical circumstances. They underscore the interconnectedness of strategy, logistics, and human endurance. Brilliant tactical maneuvers can be nullified if troops are undersupplied, overextended, or unsupported by critical infrastructure. Decisions made in the realm of high command ripple outward, affecting the daily realities of soldiers in the field. The delay in Antwerp serves as a reminder that the human cost of strategic miscalculations is high.
In conclusion, the autumn campaigns of 1944, Antwerp's capture, the struggle to clear the Scheldt, the diversion of resources to Market Garden, and the resulting German Ardennes offensive highlight the complex interplay between strategy, logistics, and political considerations. While the eventual opening of Antwerp solved a critical supply problem, the months-long delay had far-reaching consequences for operational tempo, human lives, and the broader course of the war. Leaders' decisions, even when ambitious or politically expedient, carry real consequences on the battlefield. The courage and sacrifices of the soldiers who fought under these conditions, from Canadian engineers and infantry in the Scheldt to American troops in the Ardennes, remain a testament to human endurance in the face of strategic miscalculation and logistical adversity.